stopped eating all the time. Have a handful of food and it'd go to my mouth. I was just eating all the time, and I was eating alcoholic. I'm getting to the age where I can't afford to sit still anymore.
A grocery store aisle was the last place anyone expected to rediscover John Goodman. But on August 6, 2026, a casual photograph of the 74-year-old actor standing beside David DeLuise sent fans staring at the screen, asking the same stunned question: where did the man they remembered go? The enormous Dan Connor was barely recognizable, and behind that startling transformation was a number almost as astonishing: more than 200 pounds gone after once approaching 400. But this wasn't a sudden Hollywood makeover, and the photograph wasn't really about weight at all. There's a lot more to John Goodman's transformation that has made him unrecognizable. 400 pounds and 30 years of battling personal demons. Goodman was no longer the struggling young actor who had arrived in New York with little money and no connections. Roseanne had made him a household name, and his film career had taken off with movies such as Raising Arizona, Barton Fink, and The Big Lebowski. From the outside, he was at the height of his professional success. But behind that success, his weight, now approaching 400 pounds, had become part of a cycle that had followed him for years. He would lose dramatic amounts of weight, feel better, then return to indulgence and eventually gain much of it back. Goodman has joked about those cycles in retrospect, but underneath them was a serious physical and psychological struggle. To make matters even more complicated, he had been drinking for decades, and by his own account, alcohol had become so destructive that it was eventually a matter of life or death. The contrast was striking because the man America saw on television still appeared to be functioning. Goodman was making movies, appearing on Roseanne, performing on stage, and steadily becoming one of Hollywood's most respected character actors. But privately, he was becoming less confident in his own ability to function. Years of heavy drinking had affected his memory and his confidence, and he later told Howard Stern that there were periods when he felt he couldn't put two words together. That fear was particularly damaging for an actor whose entire career depended on remembering lines and delivering them under pressure. That fear actually predated his television fame. In 1985, Goodman was performing in the Broadway musical Big River, and for one terrifying week, something happened backstage that could have ended his career before it really began. He would stand behind the scenery waiting for his entrance and suddenly discover that he could not remember his first line. The cue would arrive, the audience would be waiting, and Goodman would freeze. He later recalled being absolutely terrified and paralyzed, even considering walking onto the stage and apologizing to the audience because he could not perform. Then, almost mysteriously, he would open his mouth and the line would come. The panic vanished. But Goodman wasn't simply dealing with stage fright. He has also spoken openly about depression, describing it not as ordinary sadness, but as a kind of chemical and psychological exhaustion. He remembered periods of general dissatisfaction with everything, when he did not want to do anything, and nothing seemed right. That detail matters because it complicates the usual Hollywood narrative of the troubled genius. Goodman wasn't secretly miserable every minute, nor was every problem caused by alcohol. Instead, several forces appear to have fed into one another: depression, insecurity, performance anxiety, drinking, and the pressure of maintaining an acting career. Then came the weekend that finally forced Goodman to stop pretending he could manage the drinking himself. By 2007, he had been dealing with alcohol for roughly 30 years, meaning the habit had followed him from his early years as a New York actor through Roseanne, Hollywood success, and the period when his weight was approaching 400 pounds. The breaking point came after what he later described as a long weekend of playing golf with friends. By Sunday morning, he wasn't simply hungover. He was shaking while still drinking. Goodman later recalled, "I was shaking. I was still drinking, but I was still shaking." At that moment, something changed. He recognized that he needed medical help. There was also an immediate professional pressure hanging over him. Goodman had an Emmy to attend for his guest performance on Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip, and he later revealed that he had missed the rehearsal because he was drunk. Goodman was still working at a high level, still collecting major awards, and still expected to perform professionally, even as alcohol was interfering with the basic obligations of his career. By Sunday morning, the physical symptoms had become impossible to dismiss. Goodman later said he had the clarity of thought to realize he needed to be hospitalized. He called his wife, Anna Beth Goodman, and even the way he described that phone call years later revealed how difficult it was for him to surrender control. "I called my wife," he recalled, "which was like turning myself into the Gestapo." Anna Beth made the necessary calls, and Goodman entered a treatment center where he detoxed under medical supervision. She, as it turns out, wasn't simply a spouse watching from the sidelines. She was the person Goodman turned to at the moment he finally admitted that he could not safely handle the situation alone. The couple had been married since 1989, and she had remained beside him through the years when alcohol and weight were becoming increasingly destructive. The treatment itself appears to have produced an unexpected realization. Goodman later said that after detoxing, he discovered he actually liked the feeling of sobriety. "I decided I liked the feeling," he recalled. That sounds almost understated considering what had preceded it, but it became the dividing line in his life. He had spent decades describing alcohol as something he needed, something that accompanied work, socializing, and everyday routines. Now he was discovering what his life felt like without it. In a later interview with The Guardian, he described the decision in much darker terms. After 30 years of a disease that was taking its toll on everyone around him, drinking had become increasingly debilitating. It was life or death, he said. It was time to stop. And Goodman was unusually specific about what alcohol had been doing to him. When asked whether it had affected his work, he answered simply, "Yes, it certainly was." He identified 3 areas: temperament, memory, depression. There was a reason he became uncomfortable discussing it in interviews too. During that 2012 Guardian conversation, Goodman became visibly agitated when the discussion stayed on his alcoholism. He told the reporter that he didn't want to dredge up very unpleasant things simply to sell a movie. Even years into sobriety, he regarded those memories as painful and intensely private. But 2007 did not magically erase 30 years of addiction. Goodman has said that even years into sobriety, he would sometimes dream about drinking bourbon and argue with himself inside the dream about whether he should have another drink. The difference was that he could wake up and realize he hadn't actually done it. Over time, those dreams became almost amusing to him rather than terrifying. Now it was time for the physical transformation. But let's not rush to that part. There's a lot more that happened in the meantime, and these events were perhaps just as transformative. The actor behind the giant. John Goodman could have spent the rest of his career being introduced as Dan Connor from Roseanne. Instead, he built something much stranger and more impressive. A film career in which he could be a warm father in one movie, a terrifying brute in another, and a completely unhinged Vietnam veteran before lunch. His first major connection with the Coen brothers came in Raising Arizona in 1987, where he played escaped convict Gail Snotes. That began one of the most productive actor-director relationships of his career, eventually leading to films including Barton Fink, The Hudsucker Proxy, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, Inside Llewyn Davis, and The Big Lebowski. Then came The Big Lebowski in 1998, and Goodman found the role that would follow him forever. Walter Sobchak was enormous, aggressive, paranoid, strangely philosophical, and obsessed with his Vietnam experience. On paper, the character could have been a cartoon. Goodman made him frighteningly human. The movie itself initially underperformed and failed to impress many critics, but something unexpected happened afterward. It became a cult phenomenon. Years later, Lebowski festivals were drawing crowds of people dressed as the Dude, Walter, and the other characters. Goodman had inadvertently helped create one of cinema's most enduring cult figures. But Walter was only one piece of the puzzle. Goodman could disappear into almost anything. In Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, he became the intimidating Big Dan Teague. In Monsters, Inc., his voice gave James P. Sully Sullivan an entirely different kind of warmth, turning a gigantic blue monster into a beloved children's character. Then came The Artist, where he played Hollywood studio boss Al Zimmer, followed by Argo, Flight, 10 Cloverfield Lane, Patriots Day, and countless other performances. The range was extraordinary: comedy, drama, animation, crime, historical stories, and outright absurdity. The Guardian once described him as having an unusual ability to move between hilarity and pathos, while his imposing physical presence could make him threatening before he had even spoken. That physical presence became part of the illusion. Audiences often remembered Goodman as enormous because so many of his characters were built around that imposing frame. But directors seemed to understand something viewers sometimes missed. The size was only the surface. Goodman could be intimidating and gentle within the same scene, sometimes without changing his voice. The Coen brothers particularly understood that quality. Goodman said he loved working with them because of the precision of their work. The writers didn't need John Goodman to explain a character's emotions. They gave him strong material and trusted his contradictions to come through naturally. Despite early stage fright, he never abandoned theater, returning decades later for productions such as American Buffalo in London in 2015. He described live performance as being shot out of a cannon, followed by an exhausting crash afterward. By then, years of weight gain and unhealthy living had taken a serious toll. After undergoing 2 knee replacement surgeries, Goodman realized the damage was no longer temporary. Having left alcohol behind, he began rebuilding his health, setting the stage for a remarkable transformation. The Roseanne explosion, the fall down the stairs, and another crisis. After more than 2 decades, the Connor family came back. In 2018, ABC revived the sitcom, and Goodman returned as Dan, the character that had made him famous. The timing was remarkable, but how do you bring back a sitcom when the last thing the audience was told was that its central husband was dead? When Roseanne ended its original run in May 1997, the finale had already taken the Connor family into bizarre territory. Roseanne revealed that the entire 9th season had been her fictionalized account of her life, written as a way of coping with what had happened to her family. The lottery win had never really happened. Several relationships had been rearranged in her writing. And most importantly, Dan Connor had actually died from the heart attack he suffered near the end of the previous season. The revelation was deliberately heartbreaking. Roseanne had rewritten reality because she couldn't accept losing her husband. That ending became one of the most controversial sitcom finales of its era because it essentially pulled the rug out from under almost everything viewers had watched during the final season. So when ABC announced a revival more than 2 decades later, there was an immediate question hanging over the entire project. What exactly was going to be considered real anymore? The answer became clear even before the first episode aired. John Goodman was returning as Dan, which meant the character who had supposedly been dead for 20 years was going to be alive again. ABC Entertainment president Channing Dungey confirmed in August 2017 that Dan was definitely still alive. The revival, therefore, was effectively a reset. The new season largely discarded the events of the controversial 9th season and picked up with the Connor family in a more recognizable working-class setting. Roseanne and Dan were still married and living in Lanford, Illinois, but the family had aged. Their daughter Darlene, now separated and unemployed, returned to her parents' home with her 2 children, Harris and Mark. Jackie was still there too, but her relationship with Roseanne had become strained, partly because the revival wanted to reflect the political divide that had emerged in America. The writers were taking a nostalgic sitcom and placing its characters directly inside the cultural tensions of 2017 and 2018. That political premise was deliberate. Roseanne's character was portrayed as a supporter of Donald Trump, while her sister Jackie, played by Laurie Metcalf, was politically opposed to her. Their arguments became part of the show's central setup, turning the Connor kitchen into a miniature version of the political divisions playing out across the country. That was one reason the revival generated so much attention before it even premiered. Then came March 27, 2018. ABC premiered 2 episodes back-to-back, and the response was enormous. The first episode attracted approximately 17.7 million viewers, while the second reached approximately 18.6 million. The revival became the most successful new television debut of that year at the time, and even exceeded the audience for the original series finale in 1997. For Goodman, that success had an especially strange quality. He had spent more than 20 years building a career beyond Dan Connor, yet the character was suddenly back at the center of American television, and audiences were immediately confronted with something that would have been impossible in almost any other sitcom. Dan was alive because the show had simply decided that the version of reality in which he died was no longer the version that mattered. Goodman and Barr still had the chemistry that had made Dan and Roseanne believable, and Goodman later remembered that they had hit it off from Jump Street. For a brief moment, it looked like the perfect comeback. Then, almost overnight, it disappeared. On May 29, 2018, Barr posted a tweet targeting Valerie Jarrett, a former senior advisor to President Barack Obama. The post made a racist suggestion about Jarrett, who is black, and immediately triggered a national firestorm. Barr apologized, but the damage was already done. ABC Entertainment president Channing Dungey called the statement abhorrent and repugnant, and the network canceled Roseanne just hours after the controversy erupted. The decision was extraordinary because the revival had been one of ABC's biggest successes and had already been renewed. Hundreds of people connected to the production suddenly had no show to return to. Goodman was suddenly trapped in a bizarre position. He had spent years playing Barr's husband and had genuine affection for her, but he was not responsible for what she had posted. When a reporter asked him about the controversy, Goodman refused to pile on, saying he would rather say nothing than cause more trouble. Later, he acknowledged that Barr was missed and defended her decision to surrender her financial interest so that the other cast and crew could continue working. He was trying to separate the woman he knew from the decision that had destroyed their show. But privately, the cancellation hit him much harder than he initially admitted. In an interview with Jimmy Kimmel, Goodman revealed that he went into what he called a downward spiral after ABC pulled the plug. He tried to approach it professionally, telling himself to be a big boy and handle this, but then, as he put it, he crashed for a couple weeks. His wife became sick, and then Goodman himself fell down the stairs. It was a remarkably chaotic period. Then came the strangest solution Hollywood could have invented: keep the Connor family and remove Roseanne Connor. ABC ordered the Connors, with Goodman, Metcalf, Gilbert, and other returning cast members, while Barr had no financial or creative involvement. Her character was written out through an opioid overdose. The decision was controversial in itself, particularly because the franchise had once revolved around Roseanne. Goodman, however, remained the emotional center of the new series as Dan struggled with the loss of his wife. What made the situation even stranger was that the Connors actually worked. Instead of collapsing without its namesake star, the show survived for 7 seasons and eventually became its own long-running chapter of the franchise. It concluded on April 23, 2025, with Dan still at the center of the family. The finale brought him back to Roseanne's grave, closing a story that had begun with a sitcom marriage and somehow survived its real-life collapse. You see, by then, the relationship between Goodman and Barr had disappeared. In 2025, Goodman said they had not spoken for 7 or 8 years. But the real climax in his story was still to come. The boy who lost his father and had almost nothing. Before John Goodman became the booming voice and massive presence America knew as Dan Connor, he was a boy growing up in Afton, Missouri, with a hole in his family that could never really be filled. His father, Leslie Francis Goodman, a postal worker, died of a heart attack when John was only 2. His mother, Virginia, suddenly had 3 children to support, and survival became a matter of doing whatever work was available. She waited tables at Jack and Phil's Barbecue, worked in retail, and took in laundry. Goodman later remembered those early years as lonely, particularly after his much older brother left home. He later said the Boy Scouts gave him structure and companionship he was missing at home, while teachers and acting coaches became substitute father figures. There was another problem that followed Goodman through childhood: his size. He was overweight and was bullied at school, an experience that makes his later battles with weight far more complicated than a Hollywood makeover story. For a while, however, his future seemed destined to have nothing to do with acting. Goodman was a serious football player at Afton High School, and after graduating in 1970, he earned a football scholarship to Southwest Missouri State University. Then, almost without warning, the first version of Goodman's future disappeared. A college injury, including a torn ACL, according to his university, ended his hopes of pursuing football professionally. But the setback created an opening. Goodman moved into the drama program, where he studied alongside future stars, including Kathleen Turner and Tess Harper. What began as a detour became a discovery. Acting gave him the same sense of purpose and camaraderie he had found in football. By 1975, he had graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts and faced a choice that sounded reckless to almost everyone around him: stay in Missouri and find a safer path, or go to New York and find out whether he could actually become an actor. He chose New York. At 23, Goodman arrived in Manhattan with a degree, roughly $1,000 borrowed from his brother, and almost none of the things a young actor was supposed to have. He had no agent, no powerful contacts, and no guarantee that anyone would even give him an audition. His first apartment was near 9th Avenue and West 51st Street, in a neighborhood far removed from the polished New York most tourists imagined. He worked odd jobs, performed in children's and dinner theater, appeared in commercials, and took whatever paid work he could find. At one point, he could not even get hired as a waiter. As if things weren't bad enough as is, this one time Goodman was making beans and ham hocks, intending the food to last several days, when he locked himself out of his apartment. By the time he got back inside, the meal was ruined. Money was so scarce that a package of tuna and macaroni from a friend helped keep him going, followed by $20 his mother mailed him. It may sound made up, but this really happened. This was not an aspiring star merely playing poor. This was a 23-year-old actor struggling to survive. Still, something was changing. The jobs became regular. Goodman began appearing in commercials and theater productions, made his off-Broadway debut in A Midsummer Night's Dream in 1978, and eventually reached Broadway. In 1979, he appeared in Loose Ends, and years later, Big River would bring him major attention. And then came 1988. A new sitcom called Roseanne needed someone to play Dan Connor, the working-class husband at the center of the story. Goodman auditioned, and the part seemed almost absurdly perfect for the man he had become. The struggling actor from St. Louis was about to become a household name. But the twist was already waiting in the wings. Dan Connor made him famous, and fame helped break him. In 1988, John Goodman walked onto the set of Roseanne and stepped into the role that would change his life. He played Dan Connor, the enormous blue-collar husband of Roseanne Barr, a man who could be gruff without being cruel, funny without trying too hard, and exhausted without losing his warmth. The show was unlike the polished family sitcoms that had dominated television. The Connors struggled with money, argued, worked ordinary jobs, and looked like real people. Goodman fit perfectly. The irony was hard to miss. The physical presence he had spent years feeling uncomfortable about was becoming one of the reasons millions of Americans loved watching him. Roseanne quickly became enormous. During its first 2 seasons, it was the most-watched show in America, and Goodman went from an actor who had once struggled to afford dinner in New York to a household name. His mother could now brag about her son at the grocery store, and the financial transformation was almost surreal. Goodman later remembered that after Roseanne became successful, he no longer had to worry about burning the beans. He eventually bought his mother a house. On paper, this was the dream ending. But something else arrived with the money and recognition. Something Goodman had never really wanted. People knowing who he was everywhere he went. Goodman later described the sudden fame as deeply uncomfortable. He had gone from anonymity to what he called becoming tabloid fodder, and he admitted that dealing with publicity was very unnatural for him. At the time, he and his wife, Annabeth, were living in California with their young daughter, Molly. Goodman began looking at Hollywood differently. It wasn't simply a place where he worked anymore, it was an environment in which his daughter would grow up under the glare of celebrity culture. So the family made a dramatic decision. They left California and moved to New Orleans, closer to Annabeth's Louisiana family and far enough from Los Angeles to give themselves some privacy. But there was a problem Goodman couldn't escape by changing cities, and it would soon become unbearable. We'll get to this demon shortly. In the meantime, Roseanne itself was becoming complicated. Goodman later remembered that the early years were great fun, but eventually it was trouble, and there were times when going to work became difficult. The set was famously intense, with Barr exercising enormous creative control, and Goodman described the atmosphere as resembling a big dysfunctional family. Yet the show kept succeeding, and that created a strange contradiction. Professionally, Goodman was reaching the highest point of his career. Privately, he was moving in the opposite direction. Millions of fans had no idea of what this man was struggling with behind the scenes. It was not his weight. Well, not just his weight. There was more. The man in the grocery aisle. What happened to John Goodman? On August 6, 2026, Goodman was simply standing in a grocery store when actor David DeLuise spotted him. DeLuise took a photograph, posted it online, and suddenly millions of people were staring at a 74-year-old John Goodman who looked almost unrecognizable. Believe it or not, what the photograph revealed, however, had been building for years. Goodman had already lost more than 100 pounds by 2010 after changing his diet, exercising, and, most importantly, quitting alcohol in 2007. But even then, the transformation was nowhere near finished. At his heaviest, Goodman has said he was pushing 400 pounds, and he had spent years caught in a brutal cycle of losing weight and regaining it. By the 2020s, the total difference between his heaviest and current weight had reached more than 200 pounds. The number sounds extraordinary, but it becomes more meaningful when you realize how long the process actually took. The foundation of that change was sobriety. Goodman had spent roughly 3 decades drinking before finally stopping in 2007. He later described waking up shaking after a weekend of heavy drinking and realizing that he needed professional help. Treatment didn't magically repair everything, but it removed one of the central forces driving his weight fluctuations and deteriorating health. Goodman has also explained that quitting alcohol changed ordinary routines in ways people might never consider. In a 2025 interview, he joked that he no longer grills because grilling had once been an excuse to drink. The little rituals surrounding alcohol had to disappear along with the alcohol itself. Then came the less dramatic work: eating differently, cutting sugar, exercising regularly, and learning how to maintain, rather than repeatedly, crash diet. Goodman eventually followed what has been described as a Mediterranean-style eating plan. He began walking regularly, and exercise became something he could sustain, rather than something he did only when he was desperate to lose weight. And then, unexpectedly, boxing entered the picture. Goodman described workouts involving mitts, punching bags, and footwork, sometimes lasting an hour to an hour and a half. He wasn't training to become a professional fighter. The appeal was movement, discipline, and the sheer physical challenge. After decades when his body had made ordinary movement increasingly difficult, he was deliberately asking it to move again. That is why describing his transformation as a celebrity diet misses the most important part. The timing is particularly remarkable because Goodman never really stopped working. Even after stepping away from the constant visibility of Hollywood, he remained active through The Righteous Gemstones, The Conners, voice work, and smaller film projects. His career simply became less omnipresent than it had been during the Roseanne and the Big Lebowski years. Then, suddenly, another major movie opportunity arrived. Goodman joined Tom Cruise, Jesse Plemons, Riz Ahmed, and Sandra Hüller in Alejandro González Iñárritu's Digger, playing the President of the United States. Even that comeback came with another reminder that Goodman was not invincible. During production in Britain, he suffered a hip injury that briefly halted filming. Warner Brothers said he received immediate medical attention and recovered quickly enough for production to resume the following week. The film is scheduled for theatrical release on October 2nd of this year. Suddenly, that grocery store photograph looks different. Here is a man who overcame hardships and personal demons to better himself. This is not a weight loss story, it's a reinvention story. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.